We're delighted to host this seminar today on one of the most important issues facing our country, immigration law. You know, I have a Donuts with the Dean event every month where I like to eat, so I will sort of host donuts and coffee, and students can come and talk about things that, you know, concern them or are interesting to them, and we can just, sort of process as the semester goes through. And at the first one this semester, the students said, you know, we are so excited about all the programming with the Rudman Center. We want stuff on immigration law. And so we said, just you wait. And so here we are today. And I thought it was notable that the students mentioned that as really the first topic that came to mind of something that they want to hear about and want to learn about. We're really honored to partner with the Concord Coalition and the Peterson Foundation to bring this to you today. And I'm especially honored to introduce you to Professor John Graby, who's director of the Rudman Center for Justice, Leadership, and Public Service. And he does so much. I'm not sure if he slept at home last night or here at the law school, because we had an event last night and then one first thing this morning. And he is just has so much energy and passion and commitment to the topics of justice and leadership and public service. And we are so grateful here for all that he does at the law school. His work with the Rudman Center is always community-focused and student-focused, and always thoughtful, and my favorites are always with a great sense of humor. So thanks for all you do, John, and I really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Well, welcome. Out there it's nice and warm. It feels like a nice, warm, beautiful Friday morning. A little deceptive, but please spend some time having some snacks and coffee out there and basking in that warm sunlight. As Megan said, my name's John Graby, and I direct the Rudman Center here at the law school. And I really want to reiterate the gratitude that we feel for our partnership with the Concord Coalition. This is going to be a wonderful event, obviously, but we partner regularly with the Concord Coalition. Senator Rudman was a founding member of the Concord Coalition, and I'd like to welcome Margaret Rudman and Jay Gale from Senator Rudman's family, who made the trip, Margaret, from D.C. to Maine to New Hampshire this morning. So it's wonderful to have you join us. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the Peterson Foundation, which has been very, very generous to the Rudman Center, including its willingness to fund a fellowship for one student out of each class. And this year's Rudman Peterson Fellow, Katie Mosier, among the things that our Rudman Peterson Fellows do is they commit to studying a topic with an impact on the public fisc, and immigration reform, clearly falls within that category. And Katie applied for the fellowship last spring and received it. She's one of our treasurers, a second-year student here at the law school. So she's been working to help put this event together today, and is going to continue to be studying immigration over the balance of her law school career. So at this point, I'd actually like to introduce you to Katie Mosier, and looking forward to a great event today. Thank you all for coming out.
Good morning. Thank you, Professor Graby. And thank you all for joining us today. My name is Katie Mosier, and I'm a 2L here at the law school and a Rudman Peterson Fellow. And I really am very interested in immigration law. This past summer, I worked at New Hampshire Catholic Charities doing immigration legal services with immigrant communities with family reunification. Before today's event, I also asked each panel about what made them interested in immigration policy and what inspired them. And I have the pleasure to introduce the panel to you all today. Aline Noorani is the executive director of the National Immigration Forum, a nonpartisan advocacy organization working to promote the value of immigrants and immigration. He is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the host of the Only in America podcast. Before joining the forum in 2008, Ali was executive director of the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition. What inspires Ali to work on immigration is the immigrant community themselves. From the farm worker to the engineer, the community's vision and perseverance is nothing short of incredible. Jacqueline Varas is the Director of Immigration and Trade Policy at the American Action Forum, a center-right policy institute providing actionable research and analysis to solve America's most pressing policy challenges. She focuses her research on the economic and employment implications of both immigration and trade. Her work examines the general impacts of immigration and trade on businesses, workers, productivity, consumer prices, and the macroeconomy. You can read her research in the handbooks that we all presented you with today. Jackie told me that she was inspired to do this work by her boss, Doug Holtz-Aiken, who she called one of the most respected Republican economists in DC. When Jackie asked Doug which single policy issue he would make to grow the economy, he answered immigration reform, and she's been hooked on the issue ever since. Ambassador George Bruno is the managing director of the USA Group International and practices immigration law with Mesa Law in Manchester. He was appointed by President Clinton in 1994 to be the U.S. ambassador to Belize. Ambassador Bruno was the first director of New Hampshire Legal Assistance and has been elected as the chairman of the New Hampshire Democratic Party twice. When I asked Ambassador Bruno what inspired him to work in immigration policy, he told me once he returned from his time in Belize, he wanted to still participate in the Foreign Service as a private citizen. Our moderator today is Robert L. Bixby. He is the executive director of the Concord Coalition, a nonpartisan grassroots organization that advocates for generationally responsible fiscal policy. The Concord Coalition helps educate the public about the federal budget and the need to protect our children and future generations from excessive government debt. Bob joined Concord in 1992 and served in several positions, including as policy director and national field director, before being named as executive director in 1999. Bob told me he was inspired to work on immigration issues by the positive effect a better immigration system could have on our economy and ultimately on the federal budget. He believes remaining true to our heritage as a nation of immigrants will keep us strong. On that note, I would like to hand it off to Bob to begin our discussion today. Thank you.
Pardon me, I fell down on the job in my introduction. I was also supposed to say that Chase Hageman of the Concord Coalition is available to take any questions that you might have on the note cards that were passed out. So my apologies.
Okay.
Thank you.
And thank you again to the Rudman Center for partnering with the Concord Coalition on an event, and to the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. They also contribute to the Concord Coalition, so I guess they're getting a double bang for their buck today when we're cooperating on this. And I also want to welcome Margaret Rudman and Jay Gale, who come to so many events here, and some of them come to events in Washington having to do with the Concord Coalition. So I thank them. For those that are familiar with the Concord Coalition, we do focus on the federal budget and on fiscal responsibility and the legacy of Senator Rudman. So you might say, well, what are you doing working on immigration issues? What does the Concord Coalition have to do with that? Well, basically, our mission with regard to the federal budget is about long-term economic growth. The whole reason that Paul Tsongas and Warren Rudman and Pete Peterson wanted to have an organization like the Concord Coalition and founded it in 1992 was not just to work on a fiscally responsible federal budget, but because a fiscally responsible federal budget was one of the keys that you need to have for long-term economic growth. So the generational aspect that Katie mentioned is all focused on having economic opportunities for future generations, of which having a responsible and sustainable federal budget is a part. And there are other parts of it, too, that we didn't worry about quite as much almost 30 years ago when the Concord Coalition started, because in those days we used to look at economic growth as, well, you pretty much, you could almost count on about 3% economic growth adjusted for inflation year after year. The baby boomers were in their peak earning years, and productivity was surprisingly good, and that led to some very good economic projections. So the focus was on what do you do in the federal budget to, try to bring that into better balance. Fast forward to now, and some of the things that we were warning about in our long-term projections of the economy are coming to pass. I mean, we always used to say that as the boomers begin to retire and leave the workforce, that's going to have a natural slowing effect on the economy. And as you also have more and more of the budget going to transfer programs and not to investment, you would have a lack of productivity. Productivity would slow down. So both of those things are actually happening right now, and that sort of exacerbates the problems of the fiscal problems when you think about long-term economic growth. So I want to just show a couple of slides to bring that together, but what I should mention, there's a booklet outside that has lots of very detailed papers about certain plans that we have commissioned to look at ways to have what we call a fiscally responsible economic growth agenda, which includes some of our traditional areas that we work in, like healthcare and Social Security, but also looking at challenges for immigration reform, productivity enhancement, and workforce training, which all go together hand in glove to try to make for a more sustainable economic policy. And that's why the Concord Coalition is involved in a forum like this, which is looking at immigration reform. So I mentioned economic growth. Here's what we're looking at. The bar going across is that sort of traditional economic growth, but it's the projection is that instead of 2.5% or so, maybe a little higher economic growth as the norm, the Congressional Budget Office and the Federal Reserve and several others project that economic growth will slow to less than 2% as kind of the new norm. And that's going to make dealing with all of our problems, particularly our fiscal problems, even more difficult to deal with. And so it's important to look at why the CBO and others make that projection. They're not just being a bunch of gloomy gusses. A lot of what has to goes into that projection is the demographics, which of course has a big effect on the federal budget as well. But you can see the traditional workforce, working age population, so to speak, 20 to 64, is growing much more slowly than the demographic age 65 and over. And part of that is the retirement of the baby boom generation. But it does have an effect on workforce growth. And this is kind of the chart that got me really thinking that the Concord Coalition needed to get involved in this issue, because if you care about long-term economic growth, it's basically a function of workforce growth and productivity growth, the productivity of that workforce. So if you look at the historical period there, I think we looked at 1950 to 2016 or 2018, I guess that is. So you had workforce growth at about 1.4% a year and productivity growth about 1.7%. And that's what generated that 3% or so economic growth. But now it's this. This is why the Concord Coalition is here today on this, because it's the very, very dramatic decrease in the workforce growth that is having a large effect on long-term economic growth. Productivity will slow as well for some reasons, but lack of investment at the federal level is one of them, and just the changing demographic in the workforce is another one. So that's really why you get, I mean, you add up these numbers and you get 1.9%, which is what the economists are projecting for long-term economic growth. So aside from having a fiscally responsible federal budget, we need to do something that will grow the workforce and enhance productivity. So today what we're going to talk about is one aspect of that, which is growing the workforce, and that leads to immigration reform. And at that point, I guess I'll join the panel and turn things over to our distinguished panelists who have lots of interesting ideas for that, and then we'll be happy to take your questions on those cards that Chase and Chase will be collecting. Thank you. Raise your hand. Yeah. I should mention, I just want to say, some of you know Chase. He's been around he went to school here. Chase just became a father, and so he is doing his bit to increase workforce participation over the long term. And thank you, Chase. I will benefit from your son's labor. Allie, would you care to
First of all, thank you very, very much for this opportunity to come back to New England. So I had the honor of running the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition for a number of years, and got to know the region and Ambassador Bruno and some former colleagues who are here in the room. So it's just great to be back. So a little about the forum and kind of our take on the future of immigration reform. I'm going to leave it to the expertise of Jackie to get into the economics of it, and the ambassador from his perspective on the legal side. So the National Immigration Forum, we're a nonpartisan immigration advocacy organization advocating for the value of immigrants and immigration to the nation. We really enjoy working with organizations like the American Action Forum because they're able to, in essence, set the foundation of understanding from a policy perspective of the importance of immigration to the United States. For us as the forum, what we're trying to do is think through, okay, in the Southeast, the Midwest, and the Mountain West, what are the conversations that need to take place so that we start to shift the politics of immigration reform? And this is what we've learned. And when you look across the country, the fastest growth in the foreign-born population is taking place in the Southeast. The majority of the immigrant population, movement of the immigrant population has already taken place in the Northeast and the West Coast and the Southwest. So in the Southeast, you have really a vibrant immigrant community that's growing, that's shifting the economies there, but it's also creating some real cultural and political tension, and that's taking place in the Southeast, the Midwest, and the Mountain West. And so just very briefly, I'll just give you an example of what I think is possible moving forward. Over the last 6 months, members of Congress from both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, have worked together to shape the Agricultural Workforce Protection Act. I think that's what it's called, right?
Modernization.
Modernization, yes. DC, the land of acronyms that you can never keep track of. But the amazing part about this is that lawmakers from both sides of the aisle, at a time in our nation's history when bipartisan dialogue, much less cooperation, is very hard to come by, have crafted an immigration proposal that legalizes the existing undocumented agricultural workforce, that creates a visa program that allows farmers, growers, to have to recruit and retain the workforce that they need. But they also look to the visa program and ask the question, who's not being covered? And this is of particular relevance to a state like Vermont. Vermont is, number 1 or 2 in terms of the size of their dairy industry. The existing agricultural workforce visa program is seasonal. As far as I know, cows are not a seasonal situation, right? It's 2 times, if not 3 times a day, 365 days a year. So there's been a lot of incredible bipartisan cooperation with this particular bill, looking at the long-term economic implications and need for the agriculture industry, but also redefining what a work visa program for this particular industry needs to look like. So it's not just limited to seasonal agricultural, but in essence, year-round agriculture like dairy. So I just wanted to start there in terms of a promising and in our opinion, example of bipartisan cooperation that leading to a bill that has, I think, really tremendous positive consequences for our economy nationally as well as regionally.
Jackie?
Thank you. And also thank you for inviting me here. It's my first time in New Hampshire, so I'm very excited. So as Bob showed with his slides, the United States faces a growth problem. In the decades following World War II, you could expect your income in the United States to double roughly every 30 to 35 years. Now, because of slower economic growth, that's 65 years, pushing the American dream out of reach for many people. So at the American Action Forum, we've been thinking about how immigration reform can be a part of the solution. Not many people think of immigration policy as economic policy, but it absolutely is. And I'll give you a few reasons why. So the first is that immigrants, just by living here, they increase economic activity. They work, they increase demand for food and housing and transportation. They also tend to have higher labor force participation rates than people born in the United States. And they exhibit an entrepreneurial bent. So about 40% of Fortune 500 companies were either founded by immigrants or the children of immigrants. And that's compared to 14% of the population that immigrants make up. So they're disproportionately entrepreneurial. Right now, we're also experiencing a gap in between the number of people looking to work and the number of workers businesses are looking to hire. There's over 1 million more job openings than unemployed people in the United States. Immigration can certainly be a part of that solution. That has produced record low unemployment rates here. Nationally, we're at 3.5%. New Hampshire, you guys are ahead of the curve. Your unemployment rate's 2.5%, either the second or third lowest in the nation. So immigration definitely has an opportunity to contribute to the solution. Another thing, and Bob mentioned this as well, is immigration helps with something called productivity growth. So basically, economic growth is comprised of 2 things. You have labor force growth, which is increasing the number of people working or searching for work, and then productivity growth, which is increasing how much stuff a person can make, whether that be a good or a service. Through multiple different means, research and history has shown that immigration helps with both. One last thing I'll mention on the economy, and just to give you guys a fair warning, I am a complete economic nerd, so just about everything I say here today will be focused on economics. Without immigration, the United States does not have high enough birth rates to ensure a growing population. Every couple has about 1.8 children, so we would shrink as a nation. And a shrinking population is the fastest way to ensure economic decline. You get a shrinking labor force and a prolonged state of economic decline. With all of that being said, our current immigration system was not designed with those economic benefits in mind, right? So about 2/3 of green cards given out each year are given based on family relationships. Something very important for culture and community. It helps with assimilation. The next highest amount go for humanitarian reasons. So you can think asylum seekers and refugees. Only 12% of green cards given out each year are based on economic criteria. And of those, over half are not given to the principal immigrant worker, but to his or her family members. So what this means is that it's very difficult for someone without family ties to the United States to immigrate legally. On top of that, arbitrary immigration limits set by Congress mean that if you do qualify for entry, you could face wait times of up to 10 or 20 years before you can move to the United States. All of these issues combined make up what you'll hear many people refer to as the broken immigration system. If you want to come, either there's exorbitant wait times, not enough visas, or simply no visa available for you, no path for you to legally become an immigrant. That is what incentivizes illegal immigration. So how do we fix it? The American Action Forum, my boss, Okul Taken, and I, we came up with a proposal that rethinks how an immigration system could be if we prioritize human capital. That means expanding the number of visas available and making it easier for those who want to contribute to our economy to legally do so. Basically, our proposal centers around the idea of using criteria known to advance the economy to identify qualified applicants, new immigrants. And we get rid of those arbitrary immigration limits. Instead, we say that the number of new immigrants each year should be equal to the number of qualified applicants. We also recognize the value of workers and immigrants, both in occupations at the lower skilled side, so you can think trades or agriculture, and the higher skilled side, whether that be high-tech manufacturing or computer science. Both are valuable to our economy, so we don't discriminate. In those books that Bob mentioned, you'll find our immigration proposal. I encourage you to pick up a copy. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have at the end of this, and I look forward to discussing it further.
Thanks. George?
Thank you, Bob. First, I too am pleased to be here. I'd like to recognize Jay Dale and Mrs. Rudman. Former Congressman Paul Hodes is with us, and Eva Castillo, the award winner of the recent ACLU winner for her activism in the field of immigration. So thank you for being here. And I understand there are some students from Enrique Mesa's class who are here, who teaches immigration at the law school. And Enrique is my law partner in Manchester.
George, Dick Sweat's here too.
Is Dick? Where's Dick? Oh, hi, Dick. Former Congressman Dick Sweat. Good. So.
There you go, Chase. 6 more to go.
Yeah. So I'd like to begin with the proposition that our debate about immigration in the United States in recent years has been off course and very distracted. We've been seeing the movement of migrants, millions of people moving all over the globe. And the debate in the United States has largely centered upon whether we should build a wall at our southern border. And so the pressure on our southern border is just a small symptom of what's happening globally. The DNA of the United States is that we are a nation of immigrants. And throughout our immigrants, and throughout our history, immigrants have sort of been the cornerstone of our strength as a great nation. Immigrants work hard. They buy things, cars, trucks, TVs, computers, food, clothing, and they provide jobs. They pay taxes. They prop up our Social Security system, and they prop up our Medicare system. They don't take jobs, they don't steal jobs that Americans want. They take jobs that Americans choose not to have. They do the dirty work a lot of times in our society. They do the they fill the positions at our nursing homes, at construction sites, at restaurant kitchens, and they work the farms, both the dairy farms in Vermont and the tomato farms out in California. The bottom line is that immigrants are the cornerstone of our American landscape and our economy. A few words about the New Hampshire scene. We're a population of 1.4 million. The median age of residents in New Hampshire is age 43 as compared to the United States, which is age 38. New Hampshire ranks 5th among New England states in terms of age. Nationally, we are in lower 3, 4, 5 rank, along with Maine and Florida as being the state with the eldest population. As Jackie said, unemployment in New Hampshire is 2.5%. Nationally, it's 3.5%. As far as residents born in other countries, New Hampshire's population has about 6%. Now compare that with Massachusetts, foreign born, it's up around 16%. The result of this is that immigrants pay taxes, they are workforce participants, more so than even native-born Americans, and they use reduced social services, partly because of their youth. And virtually all economic growth in New Hampshire over the past 10 years has been from migration. And but for migration, we would have a shrinking population in New Hampshire. And so you'll go around New Hampshire and you see help wanted signs everywhere at restaurants and healthcare facilities and in our technology sector. There's the ubiquitous help wanted sign. Let me say a word about DACA. There are 400 DACA recipients in New Hampshire. 90% of them are employed, they're in schools, they've started business. They contribute in somewhere between $30 and $50 million to the New Hampshire economy. They do not qualify for social services benefits. They do not qualify for social services benefits, public housing, food stamps, welfare, do not qualify. So immigration in New Hampshire is a positive story. We're going to be talking a lot about immigration reform, but I want to just say a word or two about the culture of immigration and the agencies that administer it. My experience in dealing with USCIS and the related agencies dealing with immigration is that this is an agency that is uncommunicative, unresponsive, unaccountable, unfriendly, expensive, and overburdened.
You're right.
It is often unclear who the decision maker is and why the decision is taking so long. I've had cases that when doing an adjustment of status, it can take 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, sometimes more than 2 years, and you cannot find out who's making the decision, where the file is, or what the basis of the holdup is. It's a stone wall. If you write a letter to immigration, you may or may not get a response. And you don't know if you're getting a response or not. I heard this morning from Letitia, or maybe it was Bob, that it is now taking 30 days for a congressional inquiry to get a response. It used to be 10 days, which is in contrast to a letter to immigration by a private citizen, which may never get a response. And so if you do get a response, it's an unsigned letter, most likely. And it's just anonymous. And the letter may ask you for documents that you've already submitted. And the letter will have no phone number on it and no email address. And if you try to phone immigration, forget it. You want to clarify a point? You have to call a call center contractor, which doesn't have access to the records. If you want to visit an immigration field office, you can't, because they recently imposed a new policy that terminates the InfoPass system that prevent customers from making inquiries in, for example, in the field office in Bedford. The system has 350 judges managing a caseload of 1 million cases. The backlog goes 3.5 years, and when they work that off, it'll probably be another 3 to 5 years of new cases. So if you want to immigrate your spouse from France, the process takes over a year at times. So it's not a very pretty picture. And I'm not even talking about the policy of separation of children and parents at the border or the condition of incarceration that we have for detainees in the United States. So in other words, the system as we know it, I think, is on the verge of collapse. And I think as we read the newspapers, we understand that the people administering the immigration system in the United States are all in acting capacities. None of them have Senate confirmation. We're talking about ICE, CIS, CBP, Customs and Border Protection, and indeed the parent agency, Homeland Security, all acting. Folks, this is no way to run an immigration system. And even if Congress passes new reform legislation, there is still a culture problem with immigration itself that needs to be corrected.
Well, thank you,
And
George.
that's all I have to say about that.
And the good news is,
Yeah, I think I should put up my slides about unsustainable budget deficits again. You know, when we're thinking about this forum, there are so many aspects to the immigration issue, and I think everybody, ticked out part of them. I mean, there's the legal immigration system that Jackie has written about, and but there's also the there's asylum seekers, refugees. George mentioned the DACA program, deferred action for childhood arrivals.
Yes.
There was something called the Dreamers,
Same thing.
Dreamers
Yeah.
Act. There's a
Same
subset, I guess, the DACAs of the Dreamers. And then there's the issues of the border wall, and so which is enforcement of for legal immigration. So I thought I would ask Ali if maybe you could just give us a quick run through of the sort of a news summary of where we are and all those things, so we're clear about the different aspects of the problem.
And we're here till what time? Okay, so I would just say at the start, and I'll be very quick here, but if you go to our website, you can subscribe to. We actually do a daily newsletter now. It's called Noorani's Notes, where every morning we more or less provide a curated sense of like what are the 5 to 7 immigration news articles to track. So I was just finished off this morning about an hour ago, so I'll try to run back through it. First of all, there were a couple of reports out of DHS over the last 24 hours that are really important. One was, and the one that's actually most interesting to me, was reported by BuzzFeed News. It turns out that Acting Secretary Kevin McAleenan, before he left his role, he convened a set of DHS officials to look at the migrant protection protocols. MPP is the program that's in place along the U.S.-Mexico border that is telling somebody, let's say from Honduras, who's coming to the U.S. And is applying for asylum, that they must wait in Mexico until their asylum case is brought before an immigration judge. This has created an incredible amount of tension on the Mexican side of the border. We've seen reports of families subject to violence, extortion in Mexico because they're being forced to wait. We've talked to legal services providers, say in El Paso, who are really struggling to provide legal services to families who are stranded, in essence, in Mexico. The report, again, written by DHS officials, convened by McAleenan, found that the migrant protection protocols, to summarize, are causing more problems than they're solving. So that's news item number one. News item number two, really from the week, is that on Tuesday, the Supreme Court heard arguments around the deferred action for childhood arrivals that the ambassador mentioned. The case is hinging on whether or not the administration went through the correct process to rescind the program. The early reporting from the initial reporting from the hearing is that it seems that the justices will likely side with the administration in terms of allowing them to rescind the program. I don't necessarily find that surprising because I don't think it's, one administration should be able to change a policy, an executive policy of a previous administration. The question will be through what process will the administration actually end the program? So let me just kind of end here because I could really, there's so much news. Just a forecast into next year. So we anticipate that the Supreme Court will issue a ruling in June. The president, in fact, on Tuesday morning tweeted that, we tweeted a number of things in 200 characters, but the administration seems to be lining up towards using a Supreme Court decision around DACA to strike a deal with Democrats. In early 2018, the president had an offer on the table from Senator Schumer that said, protection for dreamers, and you get $25 billion for the wall. The administration said no thanks because they wanted to slash legal immigration. So looking forward into next year, I think what will happen is that Supreme Court will say the program can be ended. The administration will say we're going to end the program and use it as, in essence, as a political cudgel. And Democrats and Dreamers will be faced with the decision of, are we going to take protection for Dreamers with what the administration will likely demand, in that they will demand increases in border and interior enforcement and slashes to legal immigration. At which point I might turn it over to you, Jackie, to talk about what is the administration thinking about in terms of legal immigration and the point system, et cetera. Sorry.
Sure. So earlier this year, you guys, I don't know if you saw it or you might have missed it. It was kind of quiet. President Trump rolled out his immigration reform proposal. There wasn't a lot of details, but he spoke generally about what it is. They are trying to do a point system that would target high-skilled immigrants. They do not see value in workers, foreign-born workers on the lower-skilled spectrum. So those folks I talked about, agriculture, construction, where we really need them. They are trying to both make our immigration system completely about the masters, PhDs, tech folks, and at the same time cut family visas. So there was some analyses done, and I think on net their proposal would cut legal immigration. Even though it claims to keep levels the same because of certain nuances, the actual level of legal immigrants each year would be cut. So that is in contrast to our proposal. We also came up with a point system. But in ours, like I mentioned, we don't discriminate. A job is a job. Some people have talked about valuing immigrants based on how much money they make or what degree they have. In my opinion, if there's a job in our economy and you can get someone to hire you, or you have skills that position you well to get hired, you are valuable. So that's the gist of it.
And
And that's similar to the Canadian system, right? That the Canadian system has targeted certain sectors in Canada that are in need of workers, and it could be a ditch digger or a baker. If you have those skills and you're willing to resettle in that part of the country, you're welcome to Canada.
that is on a broader question, and if nobody knows the answer, we can move on to something else. But how does our system generally compare with the way immigration is treated in other countries? I mean, are we a more welcoming country or less?
The focus of immigration reform in recent years has been to attack what we've now called illegal immigrants coming into the United States. And then we went from that to attacking legal immigration. So we are constricting the entry of talent and energy coming into the United States. I'll give you one example. The high-tech industry sector in the United States, our computer programmers and our whole cyber field can't get enough qualified workers. And traditionally, they have come from other countries, or they've come from foreign students earning advanced degrees in the United States. And the way they remain in the United States is by applying for an H-1B visa. Well, we give out 50,000 H-1B visas each year. The window opens on April 1st and goes until the visas are exhausted. And these are the professionals. These are people with bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, PhDs. The window in recent years has gone 7 days. The visas are exhausted after 7 days, and then if you have been lucky enough to get your application in during those 7 days, then you go into a lottery because the visa system is oversubscribed. So you've got 200,000 applications by employers competing for 50,000 professional visas in the United States. And 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 is going to get the visa. The rest are going to be refused. So the needs in our economy aren't aligned with our immigration system.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry. So the ambassador gives a great picture of kind of the national situation, national environment. I wanted to maybe share a local example of, what is the benefit of immigration? So, has anybody ever heard of Storm Lake, Iowa? It is. It's about 13,000 people in northwest side of the state, about 2 hours from Des Moines. Their congressional representative is Steve King, not exactly a friend of immigration. Storm Lake, I would say about 5-10 years ago, their civic leadership decided that their path to growth was immigration. So from the mayor to the editor of the local paper to the police chief to the school superintendent, they went on a massive public relations campaign where they will talk to pretty much anybody that they need to, in Storm Lake to Des Moines to Postville, Iowa, wherever they need to be to kind of talk about why immigration is important to Storm Lake. Storm Lake now is one of the few rural towns in the state of Iowa that's growing. The rest of rural Iowa is shrinking. Their police chief, their mayor, we met with them. They were in D.C. just last week, and they told me they have the best problem that they could ever face as leadership of a small town, and that's how to manage growth. And that growth is economic, it's housing, it's everything that their schools, and they are fully aware that that is only happening because of immigration. So they are, in our minds, is kind of a local example of how immigration not just revitalizes small town America, but puts small town America on a path to economic growth.
One of the questions that I have, and Jackie's paper dealt with this, is why do we have caps? I mean, the system has so many different categories, and most of them have caps and limits and that sort of thing. And would it be better to remove some of these caps or all of them and sort of let market forces determine?
Mm-hmm. So that's exactly what we suggested. Why do we have caps? Politics, right? You'll hear the phrase open borders, and that's a horrible phrase right now. It's very contentious. The thing about removing caps, if you look at history, the economy is flexible. People react to economic conditions. So an example of that, in 2008, 2009, during the Great Recession, the global financial crisis, applications for green cards fell by half. People, they saw what was happening. They didn't want to come here. No sane person would, right? So we decided it'd be a better idea to trust the market and the people, and that they will continue to react to economic conditions. Another thing, even if you were to remove caps, that doesn't mean that 10 million people would come tomorrow. There's not enough demand for that. 2, there would kind of be an implicit cap just based on the processing power of USCIS and DHS. So those are things to consider as well.
Yeah, given George's stories, that would be a huge barrier. The intake problem would be a little bit slow on the uptake. Go ahead.
Well, traditionally, there's been the claim that immigrants steal jobs, and so you have the labor unions weighing in force, trying to protect the position of their members, and rightly so. But what happens when you've got more jobs than workers available? The system is kind of locked in statutorily and doesn't have the flexibility to rise up and meet the demand.
And that's that's kind of the changing workforce too here. What might have been true years ago is different as the needs of the workforce change.
Right.
A few years ago, it's hard to imagine now, but there was a bill that passed the United States Senate with more than the 60 votes needed to overcome a filibuster. I forget, I think it was 68 or 70 votes or something. It was quite extraordinary. And it did, had a number of elements that would have moved the system more to a skills-based, and it had a point system. It did have lots of money for border enforcement. So there were some of the elements that we're talking about now actually passed the Senate and supposedly had enough votes to pass in the House as well. It just, the House leadership at the time would not bring it up for a vote. It's just very frustrating looking back on it. And it also provided a pathway for citizenship for people who are already here, because we haven't really talked, aside from the DACA program, too much about that. I mean, you've got people coming in, people who are already here and are undocumented, and border security. So it had all of those elements and overwhelming bipartisan support in the Senate. What happened? I mean, just politically, we're going to have to deal with all of these issues to bring them back comprehensively. And it seems like, we talk about budget deals all the time, like a Simpson-Bowles thing or something like that. And one thing the Concord Coalition always stresses is you have to have, there's got to be something for everybody. People have to make compromises. But just kind of your take on how do we get from back to that situation where you can get all these issues on the table and talk about them in a constructive way.
It was a golden moment. You had bipartisan support in the United States Senate. You had figures like John McCain and Ted Kennedy. One of the members of the group, Michael Bennett, is now running for president. And it passed overwhelmingly with bipartisan support. It had all the elements that you described. The grand compromise between both political parties passed the Senate, goes over to the House. John Boehner doesn't bring it up for a vote. John Boehner leaves the scene. Paul Ryan doesn't bring it up for a vote. It gets caught in the presidential politics of encouraging people to self-deport, and it goes nowhere. So it was an opportunity that was lost.
It really does strike me, and your story from Iowa is so emblematic of this whole issue, is that the politics of it are so disconnected from the economics of it right now, and I'm just trying to look for a vehicle for getting refocused.
So from our perspective, the nation's immigration debate is, and this is a weird thing to say at a policy panel, but it's not about politics or policy. That's not what our nation's immigration debate is about. Our nation's immigration debate is really about culture and values, and how communities are changing and how people are reacting to those changes. So in 2018, we convened 24 living room conversations in suburban and rural communities across the country. And we went from everywhere from, I moderated conversations in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho to Corpus Christi, Texas. And our team put together a number of other ones. And this is what we learned from these conversations, is that there are three fears that most Americans have when it comes to immigration: culture, security, and economy. The cultural fear that people have boils down to a question of, are immigrants and refugees, are they integrating or isolating? Are they becoming Americans or not? The second question is around security, and the fear is, are immigrants and refugees threats or protectors? And then economically, the question is, are immigrants and refugees givers or takers? Are they giving back to the economy or taking programs and services? So how, as advocates, do we answer these questions? do we answer these questions as, okay, these are the facts and come to terms with them?
Deal with it.
Right. You don't persuade anybody by doing that. So what we've really tried to do is identify and work with the messengers that conservative communities trust, a pastor, a police chief, a local business owner, so that these are the messengers who are making the case that immigrants and refugees are protecting Americans and American values by serving in the armed forces or working at the local police department. They are giving back to the economy, whether it's 40% of Fortune 500 companies being founded by an immigrant or a child of an immigrant, or the example of Storm Lake. And that ultimately, they themselves are becoming Americans. And starting and holding and kind of staying with attention in that conversation begins to change people's minds. Because in 2014, the bill died because, David Brott beat Eric Cantor. Eric Cantor was not necessarily a friend of immigration, but he wasn't necessarily working hard in his district to say, this is my position on immigration. As soon as Eric Cantor lost, John Boehner said, we're not doing this. And literally the day before that vote, Paul Ryan was working with his colleagues on the Republican conference to whip the bill. And he was ready to walk in the door after Cantor was supposed to have won and say, this is the number, but we've got a majority of Republicans with us. So we were that close, and we lost that cultural battle in Southern Virginia in Cantor's race. So I think we've just got to recalibrate our strategies and the way we're having this conversation so that people's fears are understood or acknowledged and engaged, and then we can have an important policy conversation and discuss the important solutions that Jackie and others are developing.
I'd also mention you can't pass a bill like 2013 Comprehensive Immigration Reform without the support of the president. You need the president to be an advocate for you. So I'm not sure what that could look like in the coming years, but that's something that definitely you need to consider.
And yet, on the campaign trail, so the economics of it are not really discussed in the campaign trail as nearly as much as the border wall.
Yeah, or they perpetuate falsehoods a lot of the times. You'll see that coming from certain members of the administration repeating these claims that immigrants steal jobs and it's a race to the bottom, they lower wages. The research does not bear that out. On jobs, like I mentioned in my opening, because immigrants generate economic activity, they're actually job creators, right? We didn't go from a country of 13 colonies to one of over 300 million people today and have people say, oh, I shouldn't have kids. Your kid's going to take my kid's job, right? Don't have that seventh child because you're going to take a job from someone. It doesn't work that way. On wages, the research is mixed, I'll admit, and it really depends what sectors you're in and what education level you have. But where people are most concerned on the lower skilled side, the evidence also, the only people really harmed are men without high school degrees and previous immigrants. And that there's no consensus of that by any means, but people will point to that research. Either way, the impact, positive or negative, is mixed, right? And it's small. So the evidence doesn't support what you'll hear people say about wages. Because when immigrants increase productivity growth increases wages.
Can I just talk about it? Because I've been led to believe that there are presidential candidates coming through the state from time to time. So we've been looking at a lot of this research, and for a Republican voter, immigration is top priority, number one. For a Democratic voter, immigration is number 10. And there are a lot of trade-offs that go into kind of how people make that decision and the intensity behind it, and much less the position. In 2018, the Democrats, as they were, particularly in the House side, they avoided immigration at all costs on the campaign trail. Republicans leaned into it. Speaker, or then Leader Pelosi, said in 2018 there's no mandate for immigration reform. My response is, if you don't ask for a mandate, you don't get a mandate. So I think that the questions that need to be asked, and it's playing out again the very same way with the Democratic presidential candidates, in that they don't want to talk about this. I mean, when they do, they're cornered into your very hard left positions of abolish ICE, et cetera, which we don't think, or sanctuary cities, which we're absolutely not in favor of. So I think the question that needs to be asked of presidential candidates as they're coming through New Hampshire is that when it comes to immigration, how can we be a nation of laws and a nation of grace? That then forces them to lay out a position that says, okay, this is how we need to shape our enforcement around immigration, but this is also how we need to shape the way we're treating people in immigration. It may or may not be the perfect question, but right now they're not being asked the right question, much less any question when it comes to immigration.
And I think from, just to go back to that Senate bill, one of the things that caught my attention is that it did score as a deficit reduction over the 10-year period, and even more so over the 20-year period. Now, it's not dramatic. It's not something like, gee, if we pass immigration reform, we don't need to do these other things. But it did help push things in the right direction. And it did show that spending would increase because you bring more people into the country. You're going to end up spending more money. If you legalize people that are here or document them, I don't want to use improper phrases, but I mean if people who are undocumented or unable to work now were given a pathway to citizenship, or at least for workforce, you would increase federal spending. You'd also increase state spending. But you would also be increasing revenues, and because people would be earning money and paying taxes on that, people would be able to work where they might not be able to work now and paying taxes on that. And the economy would grow faster, and so you'd get some sort of natural revenue growth from that. And when the Congressional Budget Office looked at the provisions of that bill, found that on balance, the revenue growth would be higher than the spending growth, and so you would end up with a net deficit reduction. And there was a very extensive report done 2016, I think, from the National Academies of Sciences. And I've got the book. It's like, I mean, if you, it's even bigger than our book here, trying to wade through. But you know, it again came down on the side of immigration being a net plus over the long term. And so that's true of the Senate bill as well. I just, when the CBO looked at it, it among its effects, it said it would increase the size of the labor force and employment. That seems like a no-brainer. It said it would increase wages, average wages, which is interesting relative to Jackie's last point, but not right away. It said it like in 2025.
Yeah, that's important.
This was a few days. Yeah, this was a few years ago. So it would say, that was like within about 10 years, you would get increased average wages. So it's not a quick fix, but it's something that bleeds into a stronger economy and wage increase over time. Slightly raise the unemployment rate through 2020. Again, there might be some competing effects, but longer term, it wouldn't have that. It said that it would boost the amount of capital investment, more workers, people would have more confidence investing because they would be the workers to pick up the slack, to do the work. And it would raise productivity of labor and capital, and as a result, slightly increase interest rates. Interest rates are pretty low right now, so I wouldn't worry too much about that, although that would have a negative effect on the federal budget. But in balance, like, you know, it's not like a quick fix or anything you would do just for deficit reduction's sake alone. But in fact, we didn't put immigration reform in our deficit reduction principles and priorities exercise that people go through, because I thought there were just too many. It's not like, do we cut subsidies to Amtrak or something. It's much too global a thing to sort of put in a deficit reduction thing. But it's worth noting that it can be done in a way that is deficit reduction. But mostly, I think you'd want to do it because of its positive effect on the economy.
If I could just make one point, since you mentioned wages there, it's very important when you hear people talking about impact on wages to distinguish between short-term and long-term, right? So even if there is more competition, so there may be some slight adverse wage effects, there's a difference between year 1 and year 2 and year 5 and year 10. And what the research has shown overwhelmingly is that in the longer term, when the labor force has an opportunity to reach a new equilibrium, like as we like to call it, the effects are overwhelmingly positive because of productivity growth and other things.
And I think the National Academy's report was, one of the points that they were making is that second generation, first generation would probably have a bigger draw on federal budget and less on taxes, but by second generation, it's less of a draw on federal programs and higher on the contribution. So it's really an investment.
And the reason, if you read their report, it is a book. It is very long, but the reason they
you
found
wouldn't read it. It's
well,
research.
my boss read it. The reason they found that the first generation didn't have as great of impact as the second is because of birth rates. Like I mentioned, immigrants have more babies. When you have babies, there's cost at the state level, schooling, food, things like that. So that really drives it.
And that sort of gets back to Ali's point in the storytelling and the narratives is that you and I and Doug reading the book and the people that write the book aren't writing the narrative on the campaign trail, and I think so. In a sense, what laying the groundwork on the intellectual framework for doing this is one thing, but then converting it into a narrative, because I think the pro-immigration narrative has been overwhelmed recently by the dark side of the immigration narrative, and so part of the job is not just building the economic case, which I think is pretty sound, but changing the narrative, back to a more positive view. I grew up thinking of immigration as just sort of a naturally good thing because, and for the Concord Coalition, like Paul Tsongas and Warren Rudman were both these children of Greek immigrants, and I believe Warren Rudman was the grandson of immigrants. So, you don't have to look very far away. But now, you just, the like I said, the narrative has changed so much. We have a number of questions, and this is such an interesting audience, and I can't read most of the questions. They're kind of like the immigration volume from the National Academy. So we have one of the interesting things that's I'm going to try to be thematic here with these, but I think one of the issues we talk about, the changing nature of the workforce, there's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence, automation, jobs going away. So are we worried about that we won't need to increase the labor force because the labor force isn't going to need to be as large as it was? Anybody want to tackle that one?
I'll start by saying I disagree with the point that automation is going to be a job destroyer. So my other job is trade, and I face this a lot of times where trade results in labor market redistributions. Immigration results in labor market redistributions. Automation is going to be the same way. So I think an important piece in combating those future changes, because, people are talking about a third industrial revolution, right? It's imperative that our immigration system needs to be flexible. It can't be locked in. It needs to be able to respond to changing conditions. And we worked that into our proposal, giving governors and at the national level the opportunity to identify what a high demand occupation is this year and change it next year and the year after that if they want. So that's my answer to that, pretty much.
There are some jobs that are just not subject to automation, and I point to just one set of statistics. 20% of all pharmacists are born outside the United States. 25% of all dentists are born outside the United States. 29% of all MDs are born outside of the United States. I don't think that those are positions that are going to be easily filled by automation.
Another opportunity, I guess, is looking at jobs of the future and matching the immigrants that come in through a point system, I guess, with those. Are there jobs? Medical aides come to mind, or people that there's a lot of the workforce there is
hands-on.
Increased by immigration. So are there any other jobs of the future? That we need to look to we need to look to immigration to fill?
For I'd say about 6-8 months ago, I started seeing a couple of articles about how the trucking industry is changing, and how you have generations of truckers who are retiring. And there's always a lot of talk about automation of trucking, but there's no sense that that's going to scale very quickly. There's, if we're afraid of an automated car,
it's pretty damn scary.
Imagine an automated 18-wheeler. So what's happening now is you have Punjabi immigrants, in essence from the western part of India, immigrating to the U.S. and they're coming and they're realizing that their families in India are generations of truck drivers, and they're now in essence kind of small owner-operated trucking businesses. So actually I interviewed for a future episode of the podcast the executive director of the Punjabi Trucking Association. And it's amazing because it's filling a very, very clear workforce gap. The community is by and large coming from kind of the Central Valley of California, but they're making runs from like LA to Indiana to ship goods. And what's also happening is that there is kind of this cultural conversation that's happening within the trucking industry. And you suddenly have Sikh truck drivers helping white truck drivers understand the community. And this is actually my favorite part, is that next to like your traditional diner at a truck stop, you now have a Punjabi dhaba, which in essence is a Punjabi roadside restaurant, because there's a demand for it. So and plus they've got now the greatest, we've all heard of like the country music truck driver songs. Now there's like Bhangra truck driver songs, and it's great. But these are kind of like the stories, right, that we can tell that I think that there's so many stories like this about industries that are diversifying because of workforce needs that are creating a really interesting and fascinating cultural conversation that help us better understand the economics of it. And that's where I think the opportunities lie, because then normal people understand it. Like, we're not normal in this room, right? None of us are, right? Because we think about GDP, we think about economic growth, et cetera, et cetera. A normal person doesn't think about that. A normal person thinks about, okay, how do I make sure that my kid is going to do better than me? And that's the way we've got to be thinking about this.
There are a number of questions that deal with the asylum system, and that's been one of the issues much in the news recently. How do you, how is that distinguished from the regular immigration system, and what are the issues that are pending there? Anybody?
Asylum changes on almost a daily basis. I mean, the latest one as of yesterday is that we're now going to start charging fees for asylum applications.
But basically, people that are coming, seeking asylum are not coming through the regular immigration system that are applying for a visa. They're
Yeah,
presenting themselves at the border for,
or they're trying to present themselves at the border.
If they can,
and,
yes.
And one of the other more recent policies is that we've closed the border in certain places. So traditionally and under treaty obligations, anybody who comes over a border at any location on that border can apply for asylum. So the administration has said, no, you have to go to one of the ports of entry in order to apply for asylum. And it used to be that once they crossed the border, they were processed. Now they may come in at a port of entry, have a brief discussion with a CBP official, and then sent back to a camp in Mexico, given a number, and then they wait for their number to be called in a camp in Mexico. And it isn't as if when their number is called, they're able to then come to the United States and appear before a judge. Actually, they go to another tent on the American side of the border to do a teleconference with a judge some distance away in a building. And so that's the time they have the opportunity to have their credible fear interview. And then lately they've been allowing CBP officers to do the credible fear interview. So the policy is sort of evolving, it's changing very rapidly, extremely difficult to keep up with what's happening in the world of asylum. One of the other rules is that in order to apply for asylum in the United States, you first must apply for asylum in a country in which you pass through. And this is happening with the immigrants in the Northern Triangle, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. So you've got migrants living in fear of each of these countries, but in order to apply for asylum in the United States, you have to probably pass through one of these other countries in order to apply for asylum in the United States, and you have to be refused in that country. So it's extremely difficult. It's an extremely difficult path. And it has to be extremely confusing to the people caught up in the system.
So I'll give you an example, and two points up front. One is that we don't think that anybody who applies for asylum should automatically be granted asylum. We do feel that the least that we should be doing as a nation is ensuring that people can go through the asylum process in a fair and safe manner. We're not even meeting that level now. I do think that what the administration has done is slowly but surely, but very clearly eviscerate our asylum system. And I was on the border earlier this year in the fall and spent a few days in Honduras, a day in Juarez, and a day in El Paso. When I was in Juarez, I had a chance to visit a shelter, and I met a young man who was a doctor from Cameroon. He in Cameroon was helping through a clinic that he set up in his village, patients from the LGBT community. He was run out of the village, and then he was then run out of the country. He found himself being able to make it to Mexico. As an African person in Mexico, you stick out. He was kidnapped, he was extorted, and now when I saw him in Juarez, he was waiting at this shelter trying to figure out what was the right time for him to be able to apply for asylum in the U.S. But the fact that he had been in Mexico And as the ambassador mentioned, that there now is pressure on asylees to apply for asylum and protections in that third safe, I'm using quotes, safe country. I'm not sure what's going to happen to him. Right? Mexico is not a safe country for him. It's not a safe country for a lot of people. And he was stuck in this shelter. Now you see that over the course, I would say, the last 18 months, the majority of folks coming to our U.S.-Mexico border and applying for asylum protection were from Northern Triangle countries, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. Now, the majority of those folks applying are from Mexico. So that's a function, I think, of the deteriorating economic and security conditions in Mexico. But let's also be honest about something. This is also a function of the cartels figuring out how they're going to monetize this process. You know, the cartels are, they can move a lot faster than the federal government. They figured out how to monetize, the movement of people from Central America. Their caravans cut into their business. So then the cartel said, okay, you don't have to do you don't have to go on a caravan. We'll put you on a bus, and if you bring a kid with you, that increases your chances. The administration shut that door. I think in a way that has blocked cases that have standing. But now the cartels are going to the interior of Mexico saying, okay, you can now apply for asylum because of these conditions. So, our system is always playing catch up, and it's playing catch up in a way that is harming a lot of people.
What does the international asylum law say? I mean, there's international law on this.
The international asylum law says that anybody who presents to the border and is a credible victim of persecution, political or religious, they should be able to seek protection. You may know this better, Ambassador, but there is ongoing litigation that's moving its way through the cases, but there hasn't been an injunction that has blocked implementation. Is that fair?
That's correct.
Under USCIS, you have to just be in the U.S. in order to apply. So I think there's also this new rhetoric and narrative around people who are trying to, under the Convention of 51, to actually apply for asylum. So, when I hear things like, oh, border, you have to come to that port of entry, it just gets me so heated.
I wanted to talk about the concept of pathway to citizenship for people who are already here. We haven't talked about that much. There are, something like 11 million, is it, estimated?
It's actually lower now, so it's dropped. It's 10.5 million.
Okay.
I think that's interesting because people have this impression that the undocumented population is going up and it's going up and it's going up, when really since 2012 it's been either steady or declining.
And the overwhelming majority have been here for 10 plus years.
Yeah. So part of an reform system is what do we do there? I don't think there's that's not something that you had addressed in the paper because it wasn't the purpose of the paper.
Yeah.
But if anybody, this concept of, I think that in the grand bargain sort of thing, you can't ignore this problem. So what are the ideas and the equities and the obstacles on providing a pathway to citizenship, or not?
So I'm not as qualified as the other panelists to talk about political realities, I would say, but you're going to have to decide if you want to legalize the undocumented. You have to decide, is there going to be a penalty, right? People have talked about back taxes or different types of things. So that's your number one decision. The way I kind of envisioned it with our paper, we had built in a temporary visa program. So if you didn't qualify under the traditional point system, maybe because you didn't have as much education, right? If you got an employer in the United States to agree to hire you, you could work on a temporary visa for 6 years and kind of prove your labor market contributions that way, and then get a points bump that would, in many cases, guarantee you entry. I kind of envision the undocumented population going through something similar to that. And there's similar provisions in the new agricultural bill So the main thing, it's very political, but you just have to decide how you want to handle it. I'll end with this. I don't think it's right when people count the current undocumented population as new entrants because they're here. There's no denying that. They've been here.
And that there was in the Senate bill, they did have some sort of a pathway to citizenship. We've had a number of questions about the point system, how it would work, and the fairness of it. Is it too weighted towards things like English speaking? Does it prioritize economic skills over family reunification, and is that a less humane or humanitarian system? So there've been a few questions about that. So
Yeah, sure. I'll just give you a brief overview. Again, our entire proposal is in those booklets, and I think you also have handouts that has the point system on it and some examples of people that would qualify. So I did not want English language to be a necessity, right? It is proven and shown that speaking English helps you with assimilation. It helps you have successes in our country. But then there's also these pockets, these multicultural pockets all around the country that I think are valuable, and we shouldn't ignore that. So there's an example on your handout. There's 2 high-skilled examples of people who would qualify and 2 low-skilled examples. The high-skilled was something like a scientist or a mechanical engineer, someone who went to a U.S. institution, because right now we make it incredibly difficult for someone to go to a U.S. college as a foreign-born student and stay here afterwards. We basically kick you out right after you graduate, or a year to 3 years after you graduate. So those people are valuable. But then also on the lower skilled side, there's an example of a mechanic that is older, has over 20 years of work experience, very good at his craft, but doesn't necessarily speak English and doesn't have a college degree. So I think it's very much we should weight people based on their labor market contributions, not their level of education necessarily.
and
Hey, can I just
Yeah,
add
yeah.
one thing? I think it's also, from our perspective, if we're going to go down the path of a point system like in the 2013 bill, it's complementary to an improved work and family visa program.
Right.
Because oftentimes I think what happens is that, and this is the way the administration will talk about it, right? It's like, well, take the entire immigration system and replace it with a point system like Canada and Australia. Well, number one, that's not how Canada and Australia do it. It's actually a point system that's complementary to an existing work and family-based visa system. And number two, our economy is exponentially larger and more dynamic than Canada's or Australia's. So this is very much, this is not an apples and apples comparison by any means. So I just think that it's important as we're thinking about a point-based system that we're talking about it in a way that kind of gives people a sense of kind of the bigger picture and doesn't fall into the trap that's being laid by some of the opponents of legal immigration to say, we as the nation only need a handful of immigrants for a very specific slice of our economy, which is just not true.
So I didn't imagine the family-based system going away. I realized I didn't actually
Yeah,
answer
that
the
was
question.
I was going to ask that.
So what we were trying to do, how I mentioned that right now it can be difficult for someone to legally immigrate if they don't have family here. We were trying to solve that problem. So there are many benefits to family-based immigration. Canada prioritizes family-based immigration as well. And the beauty about a point system, you can give points for whatever you want. It's very flexible and you can change it. So I think we didn't do a very good job of thinking about transition rules. The paper was kind of like an overview, what could a change look like? But when you get into actual legislation, those details are going to need to be worked out.
We also had a number of questions about the role and responsibility of employers for making sure that the people that they hire are legally entitled to work in the United States. Is there something that the federal government should be doing more to, I guess you could say, enforce make sure that the laws we have on the books now are enforced?
So there are a couple of things that the federal government is already doing. One is that increasingly, if an employer hires a worker, they are required to submit the employee's Social Security number to a federal database to see if there is a match between the number and that person's actual identity. And this is becoming more and more pervasive. Secondly, every employer has to fill out a form called an I-9 and keep it in the employee's personnel file to indicate that the person is either an American citizen, has a green card, and is properly documented. And that form goes into the personnel file and is subject to an audit from time to time by ICE officers. And that I-9 form is applicable not only to persons who are foreign born, but every American citizen. So if you're in the working world and your employer has, I think, more than 5 or 10 employees, that employer is required to have you complete an I-9 form within like 24, 36 hours of your arrival at the employment site and put in your personnel file.
I would go back to the example that I talked about at the beginning, this Agricultural Workforce Modernization Act. So E-Verify is one of the primary tools that the federal government uses to hold employers accountable. We, as the forum, believe that E-Verify is an important program in the context of legalization of the undocumented population. If the undocumented population doesn't have a path to legal status and E-Verify is put into place, you have the agricultural industry, services, construction, et cetera, that in essence are just decimated. And what happens when an audit takes place is that these are individuals that they're not deported, they're pushed out of that job, and we feel that they are then pushed into jobs that are further underground, and that they're exploited, the legal immigrant is exploited, as well as the American-born worker. They're undermined, much less the employers trying to play by the rules. But this agricultural workforce bill, it includes an E-Verify provision. So I think for probably one of the first times is they have said that if the existing undocumented agricultural workforce is legalized, the agricultural sector, the farmers, if you will, they will support E-Verify for their industry because, in essence, they will have a stable workforce. One without the other destabilizes the agricultural industry in a pretty dramatic way.
I'm going to take the last 10 minutes here to talk about the future, and I'll give Ali and Jackie a chance to think about what the next steps or going forward should be. And while they're thinking, I'm going to ask Ambassador Bruno a question that came up here, which is, have you discussed these dysfunctional immigration systems with Senator Shaheen and Senator Hassan? Or their staffs? Or
You know what? I haven't sat down and talk with them personally about the dysfunction of the system, but I think among professionals in the field, the shortcomings of the system are quite widely known.
And that begs the question of why, if that is true, is nothing done about it?
Well, one of the reasons nothing is done about it is the crush of all the other issues that our legislators find themselves competing with. So, I mean, why does a United States senator tolerate the lack of or the delayed response from a federal agency of 30 days when it used to get a 10-day response? Why does it tolerate a response even when it was 10 days of a form letter? Instead of actually talking about the individual circumstances of the person for whom the inquiry is being made. So, I mean, culturally, the system just leaves a lot to be desired.
Well, speaking of the crush, I mean, I could imagine being somebody in that system. You mentioned an immigration judge with like a million case portfolio. I mean, the declining workforce. You have a federal workforce in the various agencies that are just not being supported for the demand of the work demanded of them.
Can I make a comment? I work for Senator Green Checking, and yes, it's true that the federal agencies or the service centers, they delay now and give us a response. We do not tolerate that. We ask for them to give us an answer. We make a phone call, and if that doesn't happen, we escalate it to their headquarters. So, and also Senator Shaheen, she voted for immigration reform, and so unfortunately that didn't pass today.
Thank you.
Yeah, can someone summarize those comments? We couldn't hear.
So Leticia does constituent services for Senator Shaheen. Correct me if I'm wrong here. So she just made the point that Senator Shaheen's office doesn't tolerate the lack of response from USCIS and escalates a request to headquarters rather.
Yes, if they don't respond, when we follow up with a phone call, and if they don't respond, we escalate it to the headquarters.
And then finally, the senator did vote for the immigration reform bill in 2013. So.
I'm going to read this question because it's kind of interesting, and I can read it.
You all need to work on your penmanship. That's the issue here.
And it sort of tees up the closing theme here. We're a pretty knowledgeable audience, and I'm sure many of us were surprised by some of the statistics and information you shared. Beyond the obvious, what prevents the facts from getting out to the public?
It's my job to know this stuff. I consider myself a nerd, right? I understand a lot of people get their information online from the news, so it's filtered. It's given with the intention of making a point that they want to make, right? So not many people will know how to or have the time to go into the government statistics and try to make sense of all of it. That's why I produce reports and I do my public education efforts to try to get these facts out the best I can.
I mean, I just want to underscore the importance of organizations like the American Action Forum because it is the moderate and the conservative voter who is struggling most with the question of immigration, and they will trust organizations like the American Action Forum, like the Peterson Institute, because these are organizations that speak to their people's concerns. So I think it's also a balance of not just breaking through the filters, but also making sure that we're breaking through the filters with messengers that are trusted by the audience that we're trying to reach.
And part of that seems to be sort of the terminology that's used too. I mean, there were several questions about terms like illegals or I don't know. There was another term in here I can't remember, but it's one that you hear frequently. But anyway, I mean I guess getting the terminology, using terminology that's not turning somebody off, or seems to me an important part of it too.
I often talk about the example of sanctuary cities, right? So And a lot of our colleagues to the left are very, very strong proponents of sanctuary cities. For us as an organization, for me as an individual, I don't want to live in a sanctuary city. I want to live in a safe city. And a safe city is where every cop on the corner can do their job, fulfill their oaths to serve and protect everybody in their community. And the only way that they can do that in a city like Manchester is to not be seen as an agent of immigration enforcement. So through that, by talking about a safe city, we're getting to the same policy outcome in terms of a clear separation of immigration enforcement responsibilities. We're conveying to the immigrant community they can trust local law enforcement, and we're conveying to the broader community that it's not, a city is not lawless or out of control. So I think that, yes, the term illegal has a lot of really terrible connotations, but I think those of us who are advocates for immigration reform, we also have to be more responsible about the kind of language that we're using.
Chain migration was the other phrase that I was trying to think of there. Well, so we've got about 5 minutes. What I want to do is ask the panelists if we have a charge to the jury here of what we can do, what the members of the audience can do. As the questioner said, we have a very informed audience here. Many of the people work in this issue, not just taking interest in it. And I mean, you mentioned at the very beginning, Ali, some things that are brewing out there. But just sort of generally speaking, how do we get this message out and take it to people?
Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of my job in immigration is combating myths that are out there. I do it through data because I'm a nerd, like I said. But the more you all and we can get the message out that immigrants do not harm the economy. In fact, without immigrants, we would be in big trouble. I think that would be extremely helpful.
I would say two things. One is urge the New Hampshire delegation, House and Senate, to support the Agricultural Workforce Modernization Act. It's a bipartisan bill that there's a lot good in there. It would be great to get something bipartisan up and moving in this environment. So that would be my first request, and it's very specific. And number two, as presidential candidates are rolling through town, ask them about immigration. And ask them about immigration in a way that balances what the future of immigration, legal immigration looks like, but also give them an opportunity to speak to the need for a rational and humane enforcement system.
I agree with the comments of my colleagues on the panel, and what does an immigration reform package look like? Well, in my mind, it has at least four elements. One, it has secure borders. Second, it has a path to citizenship for DACA, for parents of DACA, for long-term residents. Three, it has a program of permanent and temporary employment for a 21st century economy. And finally, it has a humanitarian relief program consistent with our values and our legal obligations. And these are things I think we can accomplish. We're a great nation. We just need the leadership to get it done.
And I'll just close by saying, from our point of view as the Concord Coalition, I mean, our mission is public education on these issues, and I think it matters to people, it should matter to people, that we think about the opportunity of immigrants and immigration to strengthen the future of the country, and think of the opportunities that there are there. George just laid out a wonderful bill, and I hope it passes. But so I think that it's incumbent upon all of us to try to tell not just the statistics, we should do that, but I think, and Jackie and I can be the nerds and do that, but I think we need to listen to Ali to make the personal case, the storytelling, because they're very strong, and and I think people, when they think about it, everybody knows the story of successful immigrants and what they've contributed to the community. And so I think that that's an important thing. And then we'll leave it to George to write the bill, because he just did, and it's a wonderful thing. So I want to thank John and the Rudman Center again for hosting us, and this has been a terrific forum, and thank you very much.